we now want to create a pop-up in our game. Depending on whether we have managed to complete a level or not, it will give us visual feedback and also allow us to leave the game scene and move on in our game. As of now, we are pretty much stuck in the game scene, even if we manage to hit all the enemies or run out of birds. There is no way for us to either reset or move on to another scene, which isn't really optimal. Before we will create the new class for our pop-ups, I will quickly go back to our asset catalog where we will need to add the appropriate images for the pop-ups and the buttons we will use with them. You can find these graphics in the pop-up folder in your resources. So I'll just drag these 5 images in here. And as I've done that, I will also create a new folder for them, which I will call pop-up to make this slightly more organized. We now have all the images we need. One for the stage cleared pop-up, one for the stage failed pop-up, and one for each of our 3 buttons we will use: retry, next level, and menu button. Okay, I can now create a new file in the custom nodes group. It will be a Cocoa Touch class, and once again, a subclass of SK_SpriteNode. I'll call the new class PopUp and then create it. As always, we need to import SpriteKit to avoid errors, and we can then begin implementing the new class. So let's think about what we will need here. We'll need a type for our pop-up, since we do have different pop-ups that we can show. So I will create a new constant called type, which will be an integer. As soon as I've added this, I will need an initializer with a parameter called type, which of course will be an integer, and a size parameter, which will be of type CGSize. I want to display this pop-up node pretty much over the complete frame of our camera node later, which I will pass to the size parameter also later. I can then add the visual elements of the pop-up, so the image and the buttons as children to this invisible frame filling node. In the initializer, I begin by setting self.type to set my property. I can then directly call the superclass initializer with super.init. And then, using the initializer we all have always used with the texture, color, and size parameters. For the texture, I will pass nil, and the color will be UIColor.clear, since like I said, the node itself will be invisible. For the size, I will just pass the size parameter from the init. If I now add the required initializer, my error disappears. Next, we will have to create the actual layout of the pop-up node, and we will create a new method for this, which I will call setUpPopup without parameters. And I will call this method right at the end of my initializer. Inside of this new method, I now want to create the visuals for my pop-up, depending on what type of pop-up we need. We'll add the appropriate pop-up image, either for stage cleared or stage failed, and then add the 3 buttons to allow us to interact with the pop-up. Let's begin with the main image for the pop-up, which I will create in a constant called background, which is dependent on whether or not the type property is 0, using a ternary operator. We will now just assume that 0 would be our stage cleared pop-up. So if I take another look at the assets in the pop-up folder, I can see that I need to use this pop-up cleared graphic in this case. So back in the pop-up class, I will initialize background as an SK_SpriteNode with the image named pop-up cleared if type is 0. If the type isn't 0, the player has failed the level, and I will therefore initialize this as a SK_SpriteNode with the image named pop-up failed which will automatically show the right image depending on our situation. I then want to resize this image properly by calling background.aspectScale, and then I want to scale this to the PopupNode's size property itself, which, as I said, will be our complete camera frame. This will then allow us to scale elements in relation to this complete screen, just like so. Width will be false, and the multiplier will be set to 0.5, which will render this image at half the height of our screen. We can now continue by adding our buttons next. And I do think the easiest way would be to just position them below the pop-up image itself, which also happens to look pretty good. But before we can actually initialize the buttons, we will of course need a method that should then handle our button tabs, which I will now just add right below the setup pop-up method. And I will call it pop-up button handler, and it will have to have an integer parameter, which I will just call index. Now that we have this method, we can move on to our buttons, where I will begin with a constant menu button initialized as a sprite button instance. For the default button image, I will pass pop menu, which is our menu button image. The action will obviously be my new method we just defined, and the index now needs to be an integer. We could of course just say 0, 1, and 2, or 1, 2, and 3 for my 3 buttons, but it might not really be that self-explanatory for anyone else reading our code. Therefore, I will implement a little helper here, which is not at all needed, but will make the code a little clearer. I will implement a new struct on top of the file, which I will call PopupButtons, and it will get 3 type properties. So, static let menu, which will be 0, static let next, which will be 1, and static let retry, which will be 2. I can then use these type properties in here. So, for the menu button index, I will say popupbuttons.menu, which may be a little more comprehensive than just writing a number. Just like that, I will now also initialize the other 2 buttons. Since this is pretty much the same, I will just copy this line and paste it 2 more times, like so, and then change this to be a next button and a retry button constant. I will then exchange the images to be pop next and pop retry. As for the indices, I will say popupbuttons.next and popupbuttons.retry. These will be 3 individual buttons that will allow us to use the popup button handler method for each of them, but each with their own custom index, which we can then check in the handler method to execute the appropriate code. Before we continue, I want to set something for my next button by writing next button dot is user interaction enabled, which I will only set to true if the user has actually managed to complete the level, obviously, so that we are not able to continue to the next level if we failed the current one, which makes sense. I will use a ternary operator with checking if the type is 0. If this is true, we in fact completed the level, and I can set the user interaction to true. Else, we will set this to false so that we can't use this button in this case. We can then continue by scaling our buttons to be an appropriate size, and I will scale them depending on our background image's size. Beginning with menu button.aspectScale, for which I'm going to do background.size, and I want to scale it to the width. So true, and make it a fifth of the width by passing 0.2 for the multiplier. We have 3 buttons, so scaling them to be a fifth of the width should make it easy to position them evenly under the pop-up. exactly the same will be done for the other two. So next button dot aspect scale will be background dot size, width will be true, and the multiplier 0.2. And finally, retry button dot aspect scale will be background dot size with the width true and the multiplier 0.2. I now want to position our buttons as well as the background. And to do this more easily, or maybe just keep our code a little more readable, I will create 4 constants for this. The first will be called button width offset, and I will set it to retry button dot size dot width divided by 2. Now what are we doing here and why? We do know that for sprite nodes, the anchor point per default is set to 0.5. So the anchor point is right in the middle. If we therefore want to position it at a certain point, we will oftentimes need to factor in this offset, which is half the width or the height. Since our buttons are all of the same size, I can just use one of them here to calculate this offset for all of them. In our case, the retry button, but the other two would also work. I will then also create a button height offset as retry button.size.height divided by 2. We now have the offset for the buttons, and I will now also add the offset for the background by creating a constant called background width offset. And it's going to be background.size.width divided by 2. And let background height offset is background.size.height divided by 2. Now that I have defined these constants, I can use them in the calculations for my positions, which will keep these calculations a little easier to read. I will start with the menu button by writing menu button.position, which will be set to a CG point with X and Y values. The Y value will be the same for all buttons, of course, since they will just be placed a little below the pop-up background image. And that will be negative background height offset minus button height offset, which should position the button right at the bottom of the background image. For the X value, let's think about it for a second. Our menu should be at the very left, next in the middle, and retry at the right edge. You can of course change this order around if you feel like it's better another way. But for us, this is how we're going to do it. For the leftmost position, I will now start with negative background width offset, which would put me right at the left edge. However, since our button's anchor point is in the middle, this would be over the edge of the background. So I will need to add button width offset to this value to compensate this. Next will be the next button, whose position property we will set to a CG point. And since this will be right in the middle, I can just pass 0 for the X value, and we do not need any offset here since it is already centered. The Y value is the same, so I can just copy this and paste it here. The last button will be retry button.position, which needs to be right at the other side compared to our menu button. So for X, I will say background width offset, just like we used the negative value for this for the menu button. But this time I will then have to subtract the button width offset, like so. Y will again be the same, so let's paste it again. And I now want to also change the position of the background slightly by setting background.position to a CG point, where X will stay at 0 to keep it centered, but the Y value should be a little higher to make the whole thing with the buttons look more centered. I would use half the button's height for that, so just button height offset. Alright, we've done pretty much all we need to do, and I've created the background, all the buttons, scaled everything, and positioned all the elements with the appropriate offset. I can then finally add my 4 elements as child nodes to the pop-up node itself by writing add child menu button, add child next button, add child retry button, and finally add child background. This concludes the setup for our pop-up, which is just presented over the whole screen, allowing us to just position the visuals like this. Now I know this was a lot of just boring coding stuff with all these positions, offsets and whatnot, and it's really easy to get a little confused by this. So if you do have any questions or you didn't get why I did something, feel free to ask in the comments or via personal message. We will now continue by getting our pop-ups in the actual game scene, and we'll also have to think about how we can correctly implement our pop-up button handler. We really do want to have the pop-up button actions in our game scene to properly react to them and continue with the game, which isn't really possible out of the box by having this method in the pop-up class. In our game scene, we already have the scene manager delegate, which would make it a lot easier to just get to other scenes or reload our scene than having to add all this to the pop-up class as well. And there is a possibility to achieve this. And if you think you got an idea how we can achieve this, why don't you spend some time thinking about how we can get this functionality from one class to the other. A small hint, we've done this before. But if you can't think of it, don't worry about it. We'll do it together in a second.